Welcome back, folks, to another episode of Guild of Gluttony. This is actually a super special episode because this is the last episode that I've ever recorded in our old kitchen. Now, to some of you, that might not mean very much, and even though it was a pretty small kitchen and kind of hard to maneuver around, it was where I started Guild of Gluttony, so it does still hold a pretty special place in my heart. However, our new place is much bigger, and it's going to be a lot easier to record these videos in the future, so keep your eye out for those. But for this episode, we are making bangers and smash from the Dwarven section of the Heroes Feast Cookbook, and as is tradition for all of my videos, if I can make something from scratch, I'm going to go ahead and attempt to do so. So for this meal, Annalise and I headed down to our neighborhood butchery called the Local Pig, which is where we got all the ingredients that we needed to make our own sausage. And this place was great. Not only did they have everything that I needed to make the sausage, including the casings and the meat itself, but the workers there were super helpful in giving me a lot of advice for my first attempt. They even mentioned that they have sausage making classes on occasion, so I might take them up on that here pretty soon. Needless to say, shop local if you can, because usually the stuff that they have is higher quality anyways. Speaking of their product, here is the haul that I came home with. Starting out with the hog casings, which are covered in a copious amount of salt. Then we move on to the pork shoulder. I was going to do a blend of two different kinds of meats, but the guy at the shop actually recommended for my first time to just stick with pork, because it's a little bit harder to mess up. But this is a good looking piece of meat. It's got a big old fat cap on it, which is going to be perfect for when I grind it up. And in order to do so, I had to cut it up into smaller pieces that would fit through the grinder attachment for my KitchenAid. Moving on from here, it's time to rinse off the hog casings, because as I mentioned before, there is quite a bit of salt that they come in to preserve them, which, hey, if you like salt and if you don't care about your blood pressure, then don't rinse it, I guess. See, this is probably your dream. Obviously, that's a joke, but definitely make sure that you do rinse these off and let them soak for a little while in some warm water, because that makes it a lot easier to work with them on the stuffer attachment. So I give it the old slosharoonie here, and I learned that you actually don't want to do that too much because you can end up accidentally tying it in knots if you're getting it wrapped up around itself. But while that's soaking, it's time to move on to the actual grinding of the meat. As I mentioned before, I did get a new attachment for my KitchenAid, and this thing was actually much cheaper than I was expecting for it to be, so if you're ever in the market for one, this is a great one for you to get. As long as you know how to use it. I mean, it really is simple. Just as long as you have it in the right place, just make sure that you have it secured down with that little knob on the side. Trust me. So after cutting the meat into smaller pieces, I put everything in the freezer because once that fat starts warming up, it's going to start gunking everything up and making it tougher to feed all the meat through. So you don't want it all the way frozen, but just enough to offset the kinetic energy that gets added from the grinder. And as always, there has to be an ASMR section for every episode, so here are the sweet sounds of the making of sausage. Isn't that just lovely? But yeah, from here it's a pretty straightforward process. It's just a little bit tedious as you have to push all of the meat through the grinder. And honestly, grinding the meat was much less stressful than stuffing the actual sausage casings. Just make sure that all of your equipment is working properly and secure it into place, because only an idiot wouldn't do that, right? So with all of my equipment affixed properly to where it should be, I got to work grinding the rest of the meat, which was actually pretty cool. Usually I just buy this stuff packaged, so to do it myself was a pretty fun process. And now onto the seasonings. I didn't really add a whole lot to this, just a bit of sea salt, some pepper, some mustard powder, and then I had a little bit of applewood smoked salt left, so I threw a little bit of that in there as well. I'm sure there's plenty of other things that I can throw in there to get crazy with the flavor, but again, since this was my first time, I was being a little bit more conservative with it. So I just mixed it all up to make sure that all of those seasonings get mashed together, and seeing how this is raw meat, I couldn't just pop a bite into my mouth to see if I did well with the flavoring, so I made a tiny little patty and cooked it up to see how I did. This reminds me of that scene in SpongeBob where that cockroach is eating the little tiny Krabby Patty. Some of y'all will know what I mean. But yeah, with this little guy cooked up, we gotta make sure that it's not too hot. Learned my lesson before on that. It's time to see how this tastes, and the face tells all. It wasn't great. I think I added a bit too much salt to it, but I couldn't take it out, so it was time to get to stuffing. Since the casings had been soaking for a little while, the next step was to thread them onto the attachment. And I already know what all of you are gonna say that this looks like in the comments, so don't even bother. I know that it kind of looks like a carrion crawler. We're all thinking it. And then towards the end, when it's all kind of like rumpled up and it's kind of like the same color as its skin. So yeah, I mean, again, like you don't even have to make the joke. We all know what it looks like. And honestly, it probably kind of smells the same way as a carrion crawler, since they are scavengers and they eat a lot of dead things. These casings had a certain wang to them as well. So as I mentioned before, when it came time to stuffing the casings, that's when things started to get really stressful, especially considering that I was simultaneously trying to feed the meat through the attachment, guide and twist the casings, and film it all at the same time. It's no wonder that this first little bit came out subpar. I guess it didn't come out at all. Oh, there it is. It was just way too hard to do all of this on my own, so I cast a quick conjure celestial spell and an angel appeared to help me record this section. And thank goodness, because things started going a lot smoother from this point on. The meat mixture was feeding really smoothly into the casings, and it was kind of satisfying actually seeing the sausage roll take shape. There really was just a whole lot of meat, and it felt like I was feeding it through for quite a while. But in the end, this ended up making about 4 servings. As I mentioned earlier, as you're going through this process, it's going to be important that the meat stays relatively cold, which is something that I didn't pay that much attention to. So whenever I started getting towards the tail end of this process, the attachment was getting a little bit gunked up. So all I had to do was clean it out, but next time I would have popped it into the freezer for just a few minutes before feeding it through. But for the most part, this was a success. I feel like it actually resembled sausage. So now it was just time to cook it up. And while that was preheating, I did notice that I had overstuffed in one spot, so it did burst out of the casings. So that's another thing to just be aware of. But we had the bangers, so now it was time to get ready for the smash, which is essentially just another take on a baked potato. The only real difference is that partway through cooking, you smash it down so that whenever it cooks for the rest of the time, it gets a little crispier on the inside. So we send it to the oven, wave goodbye, and we give it a little kiss. And then checking back on the sausage, I was able to make a couple small links. I just had to cut their ties. It's just like an umbilical cord, I would imagine. I don't know, that's gross. But checking on the taters, it was about time to give them a good old-fashioned smashing. So I channeled my inner barbarian, and instead of fighting with a warhammer, I smashed things with a stein, only that didn't work, so I ended up using a jar instead. And that was alright, I guess. I'll be honest, this whole part of the meal was a little bit silly to me. But hey, it makes for some really good shots as we get these steaming potatoes. And then like I said, the whole reason for this process is to get the potato a little bit more crispy, so I just added a little bit of olive oil before throwing it back into the oven. So I brush a little bit of that on, and then on top of that, I will sprinkle a little bit of salt, which sticks a little bit easier now because of the oil. And then that's all of the seasonings that this recipe calls for. So like I said, this isn't my favorite recipe, but gotta do it all at least once. The recipe also called for some cherry tomatoes, which I roasted alongside of the potatoes. So that was as simple as tossing in some oil and then sprinkling with my seasonings. And then we just give that all a toss together to make sure it's all coated, and then into the oven it goes with everything else. I ended up separating the potatoes onto their own baking sheet because they needed a little bit less time to cook than the sausage. So I just kind of took the cherry tomatoes and dumped them on the same baking sheet as that. Again, beyond making my own sausage, this is a really simple recipe, but you can't fill a 10-minute video with make the sausage hot, make the potatoes hot. So essentially we're just kind of filling for time here, so say bye-bye. And it's on to the beauty shots. Thank God. And now on to the taste test.
Moment of truth on the encased sausage. Hopefully it is cooked all the way through. Looks like it probably is. It's pretty good. It's not like snappy. I was expecting it to be snappy with the casing. But I mean it does, it keeps it all, kept it all nice and cohesive. That's a sausage. I'll try it with the mustard. It's a great combo. Everything else is pretty standard. I don't think we need a baked potato taste test. And some tomatoes. Those are both of those things. Overall, kind of what I was expecting it to be. The meal as a whole, rules as written, seems a little lackluster. There's a few things I would do differently. I think I would just have a normal baked potato. I don't think I would do it this way where you have to smash it down. I like that it got kind of like the brown part of the potato. Yeah, if I want a baked potato, I want the works in it. Anyways, I think that's all for this one. I'll do some shots of the finished big sausage as well,
So yeah, overall a pretty good meal, and I think that this bigger sausage roll actually maintained its moisture a little bit more than the smaller individual links, as you'll see here. So that's it. That's how this sausage is made. Definitely a process that I would recommend to people if you have the ability to try it out at least once. I feel like I'll personally be using the meat grinder part of the attachment more than the stuffer, but it's fun to have that tool in my arsenal for something that I can play around with in the future.